Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in the remote mountain regions of Colorado Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1893 in the Sonora de Cristo Mountains was particularly harsh, with snow blocking most passes until late April. It was during this isolated season that the residents of Crestone Valley first noticed something peculiar about the high deliveries made by Zachariah Whitmore, a fur trader who had appeared in their settlement the previous autumn. According to parish records kept by Father Cornelius Ashford at the small Catholic mission, Whitmore had arrived in October 1892, claiming to represent a consortium of trappers working the high country. He was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair and hands that bore unusual scars described by witnesses as appearing almost ritualistic in their precision. The priest noted in his weekly reports to the diocese that Whitmore spoke little about his past, mentioning only that he had previously worked territories further north, where the wildlife runs different. The settlement of Crestone Valley consisted of approximately 30 adult souls, mostly miners, married couples, and a handful of merchants who supplied the scattered claims dotting the mountainsides. The community had grown around a natural spring and the modest protection offered by a narrow canyon, which provided shelter from the relentless mountain winds. Most residents lived in simple log structures, with the more prosperous couples occupying two-room cabins equipped with stone fireplaces. The valley's formation dated back centuries, carved by glacial action that had created a natural amphitheater surrounded by towering peaks. The Ute tribes had long considered the area significant, referring to it in their oral traditions as a place where the earth speaks to those who listen properly. These indigenous accounts, recorded sporadically by territorial surveyor Nathaniel Crawford in his 1891 expedition notes, described the valley as a location where spirits of the deep places could communicate with the surface world. Crawford's geological survey had identified several cave systems in the surrounding cliffs, though the harsh climate and dangerous terrain had prevented thorough exploration. His notes preserved in territorial archives mentioned unusual acoustic properties in certain caves that seemed to amplify and carry sounds in ways that defied normal acoustic principles. Local Ute guides had refused to enter these cave systems, claiming they were places of calling that could trap the unwary. The surveyor's documentation included detailed sketches of cave entrances that featured geometric patterns carved into the surrounding rock. These patterns appeared to be ancient, predating any known historical presence in the area, yet showed precision that suggested sophisticated understanding of mathematical principles. Crawford noted that similar patterns appeared throughout the cave systems, always positioned where they would be immediately visible to anyone entering the passages. Whitmore established his trading post in an abandoned prospector's cabin at the mouth of Dead Horse Canyon, approximately 2 miles from the main settlement. The location struck many as peculiar given its isolation and the fact that previous attempts to use the site had failed. The cabin had been built in 1889 by Jeremiah Sloum, a prospector who had abandoned it after reporting persistent disturbances that made sleep impossible. Sloum's departure had been abrupt, leaving behind tools, supplies, and personal belongings that suggested no intention of permanent abandonment. When unquestioned by other prospectors about his hasty exit, Slocum claimed he had discovered signs of previous habitation in nearby caves, including arrangements of human bones and symbols carved deep into living rock. He insisted that staying longer would have meant accepting an invitation. I wasn't prepared to answer. The cabin's interior bore evidence of Slocum's disturbing final weeks. Carved into the wooden walls were geometric patterns that resembled no known indigenous designs. These carvings appeared to have been made with desperate urgency, often overlapping and intersecting in ways that created optical illusions when viewed by lamplight. Sloum had also covered every window with multiple layers of boards, creating an environment of perpetual darkness even during daylight hours. The patterns carved by Sloum showed remarkable similarity to those documented by Crawford in the cave systems, suggesting either that the prospector had discovered and copied the ancient designs, or that the same influence responsible for the cave markings had affected his behavior during his final weeks in the cabin. The precision and mathematical complexity of the carvings seemed inconsistent with the work of a mentally disturbed individual, yet their desperate execution suggested extreme psychological distress. When Whitmore took possession of the cabin, he made few modifications to Slom's arrangements. He removed the window coverings, but left the wall carvings intact, claiming they added character to the space. Visitors to his trading post noted that the patterns seemed to shift and move when observed peripherally, though direct examination revealed only static carved lines. The hide trader's first deliveries were unremarkable. He provided quality deer, elk, and mountain sheep pelts to the valley's residents, who used them for winter clothing, bedding, and trade with supply wagons that occasionally made the treacherous journey up from the Colorado plains. His prices were fair, and his goods appeared to be of exceptional quality. Several couples, including the Kesslers who ran the general store, noted that Whitmore's hides seemed unusually well preserved and bore a distinctive, almost sweet odor that lingered long after the transaction. Evangeline Kessler, wife of the store owner, maintained a detailed household ledger that survived the decades and was eventually donated to the Colorado Historical Society in 1961. Her entries from November 1892 provide insight into the community's initial impressions of their new trader. She wrote, "Mr. Whitmore delivered 6 deer hides today. Rupert was pleased with the quality, though I remarked that the fur felt different somehow, softer than what we typically see from local hunters. The hide seems almost warm to the touch, as though it retains some vestige of the animal's life force." My Evangeline's observations proved more perceptive than anyone initially realized. Her detailed descriptions of Whitmore's early deliveries noted subtle inconsistencies that would later prove significant. She recorded variations in fur patterns that didn't match seasonal expectations, hide dimensions that exceeded normal proportions for the claimed species, and preservation techniques that left the pelts unusually pliable despite apparent age. The woman's scientific curiosity, unusual for frontier wives of that era, led her to begin a personal collection of hair and fur samples from Whitmore's deliveries, pressing them between pages of her personal journal, along with detailed notes about their characteristics. This collection would later provide crucial evidence for investigators attempting to understand the true nature of Whitmore's trade goods. As winter deepened, Whitmore's visits became more frequent, often arriving during snowstorms that would have made travel extremely dangerous for most men. He always came alone, leading a pack horse loaded with carefully wrapped bundles. Residents noticed that despite the harsh weather, he never appeared tired or cold, and his horse always seemed well-fed, even when local livestock were struggling with scarce fodder. The trader's apparent immunity to cold weather became a topic of frequent discussion among valley residents. Temperatures during the winter of 1892-93 regularly dropped below -20 F. Yet Whitmore traveled mountain passes wearing only standard wool clothing. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, showed none of the signs of stress typically exhibited by animals subjected to extreme cold exposure. Dr. Morai Thorne, the valley's only physician, began keeping informal notes about Whitmore's visits after observing several peculiarities. The doctor, who had received his medical training at Johns Hopkins before seeking his fortune in the Colorado Territory, possessed a scientific mind that found certain aspects of the hide trader business troubling. His medical practice in more civilized areas had included treating numerous cases of frostbite, exposure, and cold-related injuries, making him particularly qualified to recognize the anomalies in Whitmore's apparent cold resistance. In December 1892, Dr. Thorne wrote to a former colleague, "I have encountered a most curious individual here in our mountain settlement. His wares are of extraordinary quality, yet I cannot identify the source of several hides he has provided. The fur patterns and coloring do not match any indigenous species with which I am familiar, despite 20 years of hunting and specimen collection throughout the Rocky Mountain region. More puzzling is his apparent immunity to weather conditions that severely tax even the most experienced mountain men." The doctor's medical training included significant study of comparative anatomy, making his inability to identify certain species particularly troubling. During his years in Colorado, Dr. Thorne had built an extensive collection of specimens from local wildlife, systematically cataloging the variations in fur patterns, bone structures, and other identifying characteristics. His expertise was recognized by the Territorial Naturalist Society, which regularly requested his assistance in classifying unusual specimens. When Dr. Thorne examined Whitmore's hides using his standard classification methods, he found characteristics that seemed to combine features from multiple species in ways that should not have been possible through natural means. Fur density patterns suggested Arctic adaptation, yet color variations indicated temperate climate evolution. Bone attachment points visible on the hide edges corresponded to skeletal structures he could not match to any known North American mammals. The first truly unsettling incident occurred in January 1893, when Josiah Brennan, a veteran hunter who had worked the Colorado mountains since the 1860s, examined several of Whitmore's recent deliveries at the Kessler store. Brennan had an encyclopedic knowledge of local wildlife, having served as a guide for numerous scientific expeditions, including the Wheeler Survey of 1875 FA 55 and the Powell Geographic Expedition of 1870 API. His expertise was so well regarded that territorial officials regularly consulted him on matters related to wildlife management and resource assessment. Brennan's examination of Whitmore's hides revealed inconsistencies that troubled him deeply. He had personally tracked, killed, and processed hundreds of animals throughout his career, developing an almost instinctive understanding of how different species' hides should look, feel, and smell. The hides provided by Whitmore violated several fundamental principles of his accumulated knowledge. According to Evangeline Kessler's ledger, Brennan told her, "Ma'am, I've seen every creature that walks, crawls, or flies in these mountains, and I can tell you with certainty that some of these pelts ain't from anything that belongs here. That white one with the blue undertones, the trader claims it's from an albino deer. But the fur pattern's all wrong. Albino deer keep their normal fur structure, just lose the pigmentation. This hide shows fur growth patterns I've never seen, like it was adapted for conditions that don't exist in Colorado." Brennan's concerns extended beyond simple species identification. His experienced eye detected signs of processing techniques that seemed far more sophisticated than anything available in frontier settlements. The hides showed evidence of preservation methods that left them remarkably supple and fresh-smelling despite apparent age. Traditional smoking, salt curing, or brain tanning processes could not have achieved similar results. The veteran hunter also noticed that several hides appeared to have been modified after the initial processing. Careful examination revealed almost invisible seams where pieces from different animals had been joined together. These modifications were executed with such skill that they were nearly undetectable, requiring close inspection under good lighting to identify. The purpose of such modifications remained unclear, but the level of craftsmanship suggested involvement by individuals with specialized training. When Evangeline relayed Brennan's concerns to her husband, they decided to question Whitmore directly during his next visit. However, the trader's responses only deepened the mystery. He claimed his hides came from various elevations, including areas beyond the treeing, where creatures adapt differently to the conditions. When pressed for specific locations, he provided vague references to high valleys and hidden basins that none of the local hunters recognized. Whitmore's explanations were delivered with confident authority, but they contained geographical references that made no sense to residents who had spent years exploring the surrounding mountains. He mentioned valleys that supposedly existed above the cloud line where animals had developed unique adaptations to extreme altitude. Such descriptions contradicted basic biological principles, as higher elevations generally supported less diverse wildlife populations, not more specialized ones. The trader also claimed to work with indigenous hunting guides who possessed traditional knowledge passed down through generations. He described techniques for tracking animals in terrain that other hunters considered impassable, and methods for preserving hides that produced superior results compared to European-derived processes. However, when local residents attempted to verify these claims with Ute tribal members who occasionally traded in the valley, they found no knowledge of such techniques or individuals. The situation grew more peculiar when several couples reported unusual dreams after acquiring Whitmore's hides. Ingrid Kessler, Evangeline's sister-in-law, noted in letters to relatives in Denver that she had begun experiencing vivid nightmares after using one of Whitmore's deer hides as a bed covering. She described dreams of being watched by eyes that seemed to follow her through dark forests, and of hearing whispers in languages she didn't recognize. The dreams reported by Ingrid Kessler possessed unusual clarity and consistency. Unlike typical nightmares that fade upon awakening, these visions remained vivid throughout the day, often feeling more real than actual memories. She described walking through underground passages carved from living rock, lit by an unknown source that cast no shadows. The passages led to vast chambers where groups of people engaged in activities she could observe but not understand. Most disturbing were the voices in these dreams. Ingrid reported hearing conversations in what sounded like multiple languages, though she could understand fragments despite having no knowledge of any language other than English and basic German. The conversations seemed to concern preparations for some unspecified event, with references to surface dwellers and completion of the arrangement. Similar reports emerged from other families. The Hendersons, a middle-aged couple who had purchased bear hides for their cabin walls, complained of persistent scratching sounds within their walls that only occurred at night. Those sounds followed no pattern that would suggest rodent or insect infestation. Instead, occurring in rhythmic sequences that seemed almost communicative in nature. The Henderson couple's experiences escalated beyond simple auditory disturbances. Martha Henderson reported finding small objects in their cabin that she couldn't remember acquiring. Carved bone items, unusual stones, and what appeared to be primitive tools made from unfamiliar materials. These objects appeared overnight, always in locations where they would be immediately noticed, as though deliberately placed for discovery. John Henderson attempted to track the source of these mysterious additions to their household. He began sleeping in shifts with his wife, ensuring that someone remained awake throughout each night. However, the objects continued to appear even during periods of constant vigilance. On one occasion, a carved wooden item appeared on their dining table while John sat reading less than 6 feet away. He reported noticing the object immediately upon its appearance, yet could not recall any movement or sound that might have indicated how it arrived. The Olsons, an elderly couple who ran a small blacksmith operation, reported that their livestock began displaying unusual behavior after they acquired rabbit fur blankets from Whitmore's stock. Their horses and cattle showed signs of distress whenever brought near the blankets, refusing to enter areas where the materials had been placed. Dr. Thorne's examination found no medical explanation for the animals' reactions, leading him to suspect that the hides possessed some property that affected sensitive creatures in ways humans couldn't immediately perceive. Dr. Thorne attempted a more systematic investigation, requesting permission to examine several of Whitmore's hides in detail. The trader initially resisted, claiming trade secrets, but eventually allowed the doctor to study 3 specimens under controlled conditions. Thorne's findings, preserved in his medical journal, were deeply troubling. Upon microscopic examination, he wrote, "The first samples display cellular structures that are inconsistent with known North American mammals. The hair follicle patterns suggest adaptation to extreme conditions, yet not those found at our elevation or climate. Most disturbing is the presence of what appears to be scarring in the hide tissue, forming regular patterns that suggest intentional modification rather than natural growth or injury." Dr. Thorne's medical training included significant exposure to pathology and anatomical studies, making his observations particularly credible. His microscopic examination revealed cellular structures that appeared to combine characteristics from multiple species in ways that defied normal biological development. Hair shaft composition showed mineral content that didn't match any known regional environmental conditions. The scarring patterns discovered by Dr. Thorne followed geometric designs that appeared throughout Whitmore's operation. These weren't random injury marks or natural blemishes, but deliberate modifications that had been made while the animals were alive, then allowed to heal before harvesting. The precision and consistency of these patterns suggested a systematic approach that required considerable knowledge of animal physiology and healing processes. When Dr. Thorne shared his findings with Father Ashford, the priest became increasingly concerned about Whitmore's presence in their community. The priest began maintaining his own observations, noting in his correspondence with the Dasses that several parishioners had reported feeling spiritually uneasy after contact with the traitor's goods. Father Ashford's educational background included seminary training in theology and philosophy, but also substantial study of natural history and scientific methodology. The Catholic Church's traditional emphasis on rational investigation of natural phenomena had prepared him to evaluate claims of unusual occurrences with both skepticism and thoroughness. His growing concern about Whitmore reflected careful observation rather than superstitious fear. The priest's letters to diocesan authorities discovered in church archives in 1954 revealed his systematic approach to documenting the unusual experiences reported by his parishioners. He conducted detailed interviews with affected families, cross-referencing their accounts to identify common elements and eliminate purely subjective interpretations. His findings showed consistent patterns that suggested external causation rather than mass hysteria or suggestion. Father Ashford wrote, "I have counseled several families who report distressing experiences following their commerce with this Whitmore fellow. While I am hesitant to attribute supernatural causes to mundane events, I cannot ignore the consistent nature of these reports. The affected individuals describe experiences that share remarkable similarities despite having no opportunity for collaboration or mutual influence. These include dreams featuring identical geographical locations, auditory phenomena occurring at consistent times, and physical sensations that follow predictable patterns." The priest's concerns intensified when he noticed that Whitmore never attended church services despite the strong religious observance that characterized most frontier communities. When Father Ashford approached him about attending Mass, Whitmore politely declined, stating that he followed older practices that predated Christianity in the region. Whitmore's reference to older practices intrigued Father Ashford, who possessed considerable knowledge of indigenous spiritual traditions throughout the Rocky Mountain region. During his seminary studies, he had written extensive papers on the relationship between Christian doctrine and existing native belief systems, developing expertise in comparative religious practices that few frontier priests possessed. When Father Ashford attempted to engage Whitmore in discussions about these older practices, the traitor proved evasive but knowledgeable. He demonstrated familiarity with youth spiritual concepts, particularly those related to underground spaces and communication with subterranean entities. However, his knowledge extended beyond any single tribal tradition, incorporating elements from multiple indigenous cultures in ways that suggested either extensive travel or access to sources of information unavailable to most frontier traders. As February turned to March, Whitmore's visits became increasingly frequent, sometimes occurring weekly instead of monthly. His pack horse carried larger loads, and the variety of hides expanded to include species that none of the local hunters could identify. One particular hide, which he described as coming from a mountain cat, measured nearly 8 feet in length and displayed a striped pattern unlike any known feline species in North America. The increase in Whitmore's deliveries coincided with observable changes in his personal behavior. Residents noted that he seemed more focused and purposeful during his visits, spending less time on casual conversation and more time examining potential customers with an intensity that made many uncomfortable. His interactions became increasingly transaction-oriented, as though he was working towards some deadline that required efficient completion of his business. Evangeline Kessler documented these behavioral changes in her household ledger, noting that Whitmore's conversations had shifted from general topics to specific questions about family structures, individual health conditions, and personal preferences regarding various hide types. His inquiries seemed designed to gather detailed information about community members rather than simply facilitate commerce. The exotic hides provided during this period showed characteristics that challenged even Dr. Thorne's scientific understanding. The alleged mountain cat hide displayed fur patterns that seemed to shift under different lighting conditions, creating optical effects that made accurate examination difficult. Chemical tests revealed mineral compositions that didn't match any known regional geological formations. Josiah Brennan's growing suspicions led him to attempt following Whitmore on one of his departure trips from the valley. The hunter waited until Whitmore completed his rounds and began heading back toward Dead Horse Canyon, then followed at a distance using tracking skills developed over decades of wilderness experience. Brennan's pursuit required considerable expertise, as Whitmore seemed aware of potential surveillance and took precautions to avoid leaving clear tracks. The trader's route through the mountain terrain followed paths that seemed deliberately chosen to minimize visibility and maximize confusion for anyone attempting to follow. He utilized natural terrain features to break up his trail and employed techniques that suggested professional training and counter-surveillance methods. According to Brennan's account, recorded years later by a territorial marshal investigating unrelated matters. Whitmore's route took him not toward the high country as expected, but deeper into the canyon system. The traitor followed game trails that led through narrow defiles and across exposed rock faces, where footprints would be impossible to track. "I followed him for about 3 miles, Brennan reported, until the canyon walls got too narrow and steep for safe passage in the snow. But before I turned back, I heard something that stopped me cold. It wasn't human voices, but it wasn't animal sounds either. It was like singing, but with words in no language I'd ever heard. The rhythm was regular, like a work song, but the pitch rose and fell in ways that hurt to listen to. And there was a smell carrying on the wind, sweet but wrong, like flowers that had been dead too long but somehow still growing." Brennan's description of the sounds emanating from the deeper canyon matched reports from other residents who had ventured near the area during Whitmore's visits. The vocalization seemed to serve some coordinating function, rising and falling in patterns that suggested communication rather than random noise. The acoustic properties of the canyon walls amplified and carried these sounds in ways that made their exact source impossible to determine. The smell described by Brennan proved to be another consistent element in various accounts. Multiple witnesses reported detecting an odor that combined floral sweetness with something organic and decaying. The smell seemed strongest during Whitmore's absences, suggesting that whatever produced it remained active in the canyon, even when the traitor was not present. Brennan's investigation attempt marked a turning point in the community's relationship with Whitmore. Word of the hunter's experience spread quickly through the small settlement, creating an undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Several couples began refusing Whitmore's goods, claiming they no longer needed additional hides despite the ongoing harsh weather. The community's growing reluctance to deal with Whitmore created practical problems, as his hides had become an important resource for surviving the harsh mountain winter. Alternative sources of processed hides required dangerous journeys to distant settlements, and the quality of available substitutes was significantly inferior to Whitmore's products. This created a dilemma for families who needed the materials but feared the consequences of continued association with the traitor. Dr. Thorne decided to conduct his own investigation. Approaching the matter with scientific methodology, he began keeping detailed records of everyone who had purchased Whitmore's hides, noting any subsequent health complaints or unusual experiences. His findings, compiled over several weeks, showed a clear pattern of sleep disturbances, anxiety, and what he termed nervous afflictions among couples who had acquired the trader's goods. The doctor's systematic approach revealed correlations that might have been missed through casual observation. Families who had acquired larger quantities of Whitmore's hides showed more severe symptoms, and those who used the hides for bedding or clothing experienced effects more quickly than those who used them for decorative purposes. Duration of exposure also appeared to be a factor, with symptoms intensifying over time rather than diminishing. Dr. Thorne's medical records from this period document the progression of symptoms among affected community members. Initial effects included mild sleep disruption and occasional vivid dreams. These progressed to more severe insomnia, accompanied by what patients described as waking dreams that occurred during periods of apparent consciousness. Advanced symptoms included reports of auditory phenomena and compelling urges to visit specific locations during nighttime hours. The doctor's investigation took an unexpected turn when he decided to test his hypothesis by purchasing one of Whitmore's newer acquisitions, a remarkably soft hide that the trader claimed came from a young deer. Dr. Thorne placed the hide in his own bedroom as a wall covering and documented his subsequent experiences in his medical journal. First night, no unusual occurrences. Sleep normal, though perhaps deeper than typical dreams, more vivid than usual, but not disturbing in nature. Awakened, feeling unusually refreshed despite the standard 7 hours of rest. Second night, vivid dreams of being in locations I have never visited, characterized by unusual geological formations and plant life. The dreams possessed a clarity that made them seem more like memories than imagination. Particularly notable was the consistent appearance of underground chambers carved from living rock, lit by an unknown source that cast no shadows. Third night, awakened at approximately 3:30 a.m. by what I can only describe as whispering. The sound seemed to emanate from the hide itself, though careful examination revealed no visible source.